Good afternoon. We mentioned in our last shir that we're going to discuss a little bit about the Arizal's formula for the Brocha, for the blessing on the Chanukah candles. Whereas, as we mentioned, the Gemara says that the Brocha is Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah. The Arizal drops the word shel. And the reason is because he just wants to have the words Lahadlik Ner Chanukah. Why? So the Arizal explains because the first letters of Lahadlik Ner Chanukah, which are Lamed, Nun, and Ches, if you rearrange them into the order of Nun, Ches, Lamed, they spell out the word Nachal. Nachal means a stream. And Rav Itcher Morgenstern explains that the Arizal had explained earlier, and perhaps we'll discuss this later this week or sometime over Chanukah, that the concept of the Brocha on the Chanukah Neros, that the word Ner, which is gematria, has the numerical value of 250. That stands for combining certain names of God. The names add up to 250. They're Havaya Ekya, Havaya Elokim, and Havaya Adnos. I'm not going to get into the details of them right now, but the idea is that through making the brachos on the Chanukah candles, we're drawing down from the higher spiritual realms through our entire spiritual being, both that our will should connect to God's will, our thoughts should connect to God's thoughts, and their actions should be in line with what God wants our actions to be. And that's why they're alluded to in this word Nachal, again, which is the first letters of Ner, of Lahadlik Ner Chanukah, because, so to speak, we want to stream these spiritual forces throughout our entire spiritual being, taking it all the way from the top through our entire being. And then Rabbi Itcher Meir gives a very interesting further explanation about it. He says that these letters Nun, Ches, Lamed are alluded to in two psukim. One is the pasuk of Notzer Chesed La'alafim, that God heeds his kindness to us for thousands of generations. And the other one is Nafshenu Chiksa LaHashem, that our souls thirst for God. That this word Nachal alludes to both of those psukim. What does that mean? So he explains as follows. He says that primarily there are two different impetuses that people have when it comes to serving God. And let me just add that some of what I'm going to say, I've mentioned this many times in the past, is my own addition to his comments. And clearly, if I'm saying this over, it's my own understanding of what he's meaning to say. So at the very least, take it as what I'm saying is inspired by Reb Itcher Meir. And this may or may not be exactly what he intended. There are certain people who their impetus in serving God and the performance of mitzvos is the fact that God said, this is what I should be doing, so that's what I'm doing. They don't give any thought whatsoever as to how the performance of the mitzvah is going to make them feel, whether or not is going to bring them any spiritual high or any spiritual enjoyment. They're not looking for any inspiration in the mitzvah. They don't really care if today's Chanukah, today's Purim, today's Sukkot is all the same to them. There's a Shulchan Aruch. There are rules and regulations that we are meant to follow. God told us what to do, and we do them. There are other people who they have a thirst and a desire to connect to God. They have a thirst and a desire for spiritual fulfillment and spiritual enjoyment. And without having that, they have no drive to be doing the mitzvos. He calls these the approach of Yehuda and the approach of Yosef. Namely, that Yosef is the approach of you're doing what you are supposed to be doing because you're supposed to do it. Whereas the approach of Yehuda is the approach, if you think about David HaMelech with Sefer Tehillim, it's the approach of thirsting for God, desiring for that spiritual connection. And I would add, even though he doesn't say this explicitly, that David HaMelech is that nafshenu chiksa laHashem. Those are actually words David HaMelech said in Tehillim, of our souls thirsting for God. Whereas the approach of Yosef is that notzer chesed la'alafim, is that God is always just sending out kindness because that's what God does. And the same way as we're just doing what we're supposed to do because that's what we do. But Rabbi Meir points out a very important thing. Whereas it is possible for a person to serve God simply because that's what he is supposed to do, whether or not he's getting any spiritual high. So you can have the approach of Yosef alone, but he says you cannot have the approach of Yehuda alone. If you're driven by a thirst for connection to God, but you have no understanding of what God prescribed that we should do in order to foster that connection, in order to get a true spiritual high, then we can be thirsting all we want and doing all we want, but we're not really connecting to God because he's not there. And therefore he says the approach of nafshenu chiksa laHashem, of looking for that spiritual high, cannot exist unless it's combined together with the approach of Yosef, the approach of what I call the Shulchan Aruch Yid. You can be a proper Jew by just following the Shulchan Aruch. But you can't be a proper Jew if you're only chasing a spiritual high without also having that framework of the Shulchan Aruch. But both of these are the nachal. Both of these are pathways and streams of how to draw down the spiritual wealth from on high through our entire spiritual being. Although in all probability, a person who is more than just that Shulchan Aruch Yid, a person who actually has that thirst for God, then that spiritual enhancement will be that much greater. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.